Alrighty, welcome to the Esoteric Beat. Today I'm going to be giving a version of a conference talk that I gave a month ago at Societas Magica, which is a early version of a chapter I'm writing on Terence McKenna. Now, got about a week to get this chapter done, and I do invite any feedback, but better be a quick turnaround on that feedback. I do appreciate y'all watching. So here we are, A Term to Conjure with Terence McKenna on Frances Yates and Hermeticism. Um, so let me just read this introduction, and we'll go from there. Looking at Terence McKenna's encounter with alchemy affords us an opportunity to trace the reception of esoteric studies in the psychedelic counterculture. Since McKenna spent a little time in each of his alchemy lectures justifying his recourse to the Rosicrucian Enlightenment as a model for countercultural solidarity, I will focus on these discussions, which gave various definitions of alchemy and McKenna's takes on Jung and Yates. McKenna popularized alchemy because he saw it as a model for psychedelic counterculture. So that's basically my argument. Still trying to kind of like formulate it, like, why should scholars of esotericism care about this guy and his engagement with Frances Yates, right? I'm thinking about how, Wouter Hanegraaff, who's the dean of esoteric studies in Amsterdam, has taken an interest in McKenna, and is rumored to be interested in ayahuasca and all that. So it turns out that late in life, Terence McKenna, or later in life, I guess, Terence McKenna was getting kind of bored of talking about drugs, right? And so he got into alchemy, and he was really interested in this period known as the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, the 16th, 17th century period, where there is this kind of flowering of alchemical creativity. And Carl Jung was also very interested in this period. So we know that McKenna came to alchemy through reading Jung as a teenager. And I feel like a good way to sell, this chapter would be to talk about Newman and Principi's very seminal paper in the history of science. It's called Some Problems with the Historiography of Alchemy. Okay, let me get back to my introduction here. McKenna's first encounter with alchemy early in life as a teenager, according to Dennis McKenna, I actually asked him that question myself during one of his talks, was through Jung. And he was acquainted with what Newman and Principi in a seminal article discuss as an historiographical problem in the history of science, spiritual alchemy. So I should probably say something here. So in this paper, right, Newman and Principe write that there's this problem in the way that we think about alchemy, because there have been all these sort of occultists who said, well, alchemy is not really about matter. It's not really about chemistry. Really, it's about this higher thing, right? And Newman and Principe, they said, well, this all traces back to these 19th century occultists, right? And there's been a huge backlash among people who appreciate spiritual alchemy, where they objected to this idea, and they think that Newman and Principe are trying to kind of like gatekeep and cut off, all of these religious understandings of alchemy. But if you read their paper carefully, they'll say, we're not saying that spiritual alchemy wasn't a thing. We're just saying that, basically historians who say alchemy was all a bunch of nonsense are getting it wrong, because there's actual real chemistry that was going on, right? Like alchemists like Zosimus, who's famous in the, he was like a hermetic priest in the 4th century who used a lot of religious and dream language to talk about alchemy. But like, as Lawrence Principi shows in his Secrets of Alchemy book, Zosimus was actually a really good laboratory practitioner. He was like pointing out lots of things that were happening in his lab reactions and reasoning about them at kind of a high level. He was like a really good chemist. When we get to spiritual alchemy in the Middle Ages in Islam, it's seen as a metaphor, right? Where it's like there's this thing, alchemy, and then, when like Ghazali writes The Alchemy of Happiness, or Sufis are talking about, ecstatic experience in alchemical terms, like they know it's a metaphor. It's not like present day obscurantist occultists who are saying, oh, alchemy was never about chemistry. And so Carl Jung, kind of made a statement that sort of sounds, if you translate it one way, like Jung was saying alchemy is not really about matter, it's really about psychology, right? It's really about they're projecting the contents of the lab. They're projecting the contents of their psyche onto the lab, right? And so when alchemists are talking about these chemical reactions, really they're talking about like what's happening in your psyche or in your spiritual development, right? Like alchemy is all just metaphors for spiritual development. However, it looks like Jung didn't actually say that. If you look at what Jung actually wrote, he's saying alchemy wasn't entirely concerned with the chemistry, right? Chemistry wasn't the only thing. So Newman and Principe may have overstated their case, right? They may have misread Jung a little bit, and so there's a book that'll come up later in this by one Mike Zuber about spiritual alchemy that actually traces the tradition that Newman and Principe thought went back to only the 19th century, was like sort of invented out of whole cloth. It actually traces back to the 16th century with Jakob Burma. And so a lot of this Rosicrucian stuff, like Michael Maier's A Talent of Fugians, all these weird alchemical emblems, it seems like this is, as Francis Yates puts it, the kind of alchemy that Libavius disliked, right? The weird spiritual kind of surrealistic, freaky images and like bizarre codes and all this weird stuff. Like, if you don't know what the chemical reference were, it seems like, well, it can only be spiritual or it's got to be nonsense, right? So we can understand why some people thought that alchemy, if you think that alchemy is all a bunch of nonsense and they didn't have any real chemistry going on, you can understand how that, that people of a spiritual bent might prefer to see it as spiritual and not material. Okay. So although McKenna follows Jung on seeing alchemy as going beyond laboratory methods into a vitalistic worldview that can be fruitfully contrasted with contemporary science, he did not fall into the trap so urgently analyzed by Newman and Principe of seeing the material component as irrelevant. CEG, his beautiful discussion of playing with mercury as a child. So that's one of the moments that I'm going to want to focus on. There's places where McKenna is basically like kind of trying to explain the Jungian view, which he sort of holds to, like he thinks that there's all this great stuff going on with spiritual alchemy and psychological alchemy. And like he thinks that Jung really like helped us understand what the alchemists were doing. So the reason that I'm starting this way is that I want to show that McKenna kind of had his finger on the pulse of this debate and that McKenna was no fool. And although he kind of does play fast and loose with the historical record, and honestly, like so does Francis Yates, McKenna didn't see the alchemists as deluded, and he understood that matter was important. And he says matter was important. And I could be doing a better job of looking in my introduction at the things he actually said, but here I'm just kind of trying to summarize it. So that's a challenge for me as a writer. So McKenna talks about how when he was a kid, he would play with mercury, and sort of the properties of mercury are so kind of marvelous. And there's this like learning experience that one has. And he said that as a kid, basically I was operating as an alchemist. So he does think that alchemy has a way of obtaining knowledge that is fruitfully contrasted with modern science, right? Alchemy is different from modern science. But what he's not necessarily doing is romanticizing it, right? He's not saying, oh, well, alchemy is this superior, form of thought that, deals with that's able to kind of like reason better than science does, right? But McKenna does have a problem with modern science. He thinks that modern science is on the wrong path. He uses the prohibition of psychedelics as a key example of this. He thinks that like the problem with modern science, the problem with modernity, and and a lot of esotericists are sort of have a bone to pick with modernity, right? The interesting thing here is that McKenna actually sees the alchemical worldview, which historians of science now understand as contributing to the rise of the scientific revolution. McKenna also sort of sees it that way, right? He says that alchemists were like responsible for the rise of science in some way, science as we know it, modern science, the scientific revolution. But that's not necessarily a good thing about it, right? Like maybe that's a problem with alchemy. So he's going looking back to the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And one thing that occurred to me when I got some nice comments from Dr. James Russell, who you can look forward to seeing me interview next month, who is a Hypnerotomachia polyphily scholar, and we'll have a lot to talk about then. I was thinking about his excellent feedback that he gave me, and I thought, maybe I should be spinning this talk in terms of, well, shoot, let me go look at that email that I sent because I want to get this right. Oh, it is so tricky to share the screen and then use a stupid. I know what I can do. I just can't get my button. Okay, so I'm going to go to my email here, and it's going to be in my sent email. Good old Dr. James. Okay, so here's what I said in my reply. So my argument should say something about how the Yates thesis took McKenna beyond Jungian alchemy, which is so ahistorical, and into a particular historical period. One weakness in my argument is that I don't have much on the influence of his alchemical ramblings on the counterculture. Like if I were to say, well, McKenna popularized alchemy in the counterculture, like what's my evidence? I do have this one Reddit post, right? So I might want to make it more about the influence of Yates on his thoughts. And so like the question is, what does Francis Yates do that Jung was not doing for McKenna, right? And the important thing is getting back to my argument. The important thing for me is that Francis Yates and version of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, it seemed like this particular historical thing, right? It's not like the people that Newman and Principi are criticizing who see alchemy in this ahistorical way, that alchemy is always and everywhere this esoteric tradition, right? Rather, we want to talk about alchemies, all these different alchemies, right? What somebody in the 17th century meant by alchemy is different from what somebody in the 4th or 12th centuries or 20th century mean by alchemy, right? We have to look at the language they were using, the context, right? So one of the cool things about McKenna's engagement with Francis Yates is that it kind of goes beyond Jung's ahistorical idea that alchemy everywhere is like this psychological process. And he's actually looking at this historical period where they were trying to have this kind of like alchemical court, and they were trying to sort of crystallize this alchemical society, and the Rosicrucians who were like trying to reform their society. And he thinks that we can learn a lot about that. Modern psychedelic people who want to like build a countercultural solidarity. He thinks that we can learn a lot from that. So some of his comments can be seen as in line with Newman and Principi's critique, anticipating a flowering of alchemical studies in the decades since McKenna's death, which fully appreciate how alchemy paved the way for the scientific revolution in its involvement with matter. However, rather than buying into a triumphalist account or romanticizing 17th century alchemical dreams as a golden age, McKenna sees the alchemical background of the scientific revolution as in some ways a turning point that led to the problems with modern science. Okay, so the sources I'm looking at are Terence McKenna's lectures on alchemy. That's one of the times when he went to Esalen or wherever it was to give a talk. And he would have people, they're paying $300 to be part of his seminar or whatever. He would have the people that came to his talks where he would rap about, mushrooms and the new age and time wave zero and all that. He would actually have people read Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis Yates. And he rapped a lot about her and about her vision of John Dee and all this. So one of the talks that I'm going to look at, there's one actually called Lectures on Alchemy. There's one called State of the Stone where I'm going to be looking at his kind of like throat clearing at the beginning, where he's like, well, here's the reason why I'm calling this talk Seeking this or State of the Stone, right? He sees these talks as a State of the Stone address, like a State of the Nation address, except we're talking about the State of the Philosopher's Stone. And McKenna believed that mushroom trippers have discovered the Philosopher's Stone of alchemy, or at least that's an argument that he advances, right? That psychedelic culture is doing something similar to what alchemists were doing, and he wants to go back to alchemy, especially once he loses interest in taking drugs himself, right? Because we know now that McKenna actually was so terrified by a bad mushroom trip that he had that he kind of stopped taking mushrooms for a while. And that was part of the reason that, he didn't want to talk about drugs. He wanted to talk about alchemy. Okay, so we got another talk called Seeking the Stone. And we've got an interview with Neville Drury that is published in the Archaic Revival. Now, Neville Drury was an occultist and a writer. Wrote a bunch of books, sort of in the Golden Dawn tradition, and so McKenna gives one of his extended definitions on alchemy. I think it's pretty important there that we look at that. I'm going to be looking at two books by Francis Yates, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. I'm especially interested in what she says about Descartes there, because McKenna has a lot to say about Descartes, and I think that he's kind of riffing on Yates's discussion of Descartes. So I should probably give like a little summary of what she was doing with Descartes. And there's even a bit, and once again, Dr. Russell flashed on this and giving his feedback, so I really appreciated that. That Yates actually said, Descartes may have been inspired by Hermetic ideas. Newman and Principe, some problems with the historiography of alchemy. I've already taken too long to talk about that. Jung's Psychology and Alchemy. And then there's also a video, the Alchemical Mysteries series, where McKenna's in Prague talking about the alchemical history of Prague. I probably won't get too much into that. I'm not necessarily trying to get it's not like I have a whole lot of space. So, I'm really trying to just sort of make an argument about why this stuff is interesting and touch on just like a little bit of material about what McKenna thought about alchemy. So let's look at some of that evidence. Okay, so I've already kind of done this, the historiographical throat clearing, and here's Carl Jung from my very own PKD Tarot, drawn by Christopher Wilkie, which you can buy at Wide Books. Shameless plug, but this is my show. And then once again, Dr. Russell's comments reminded me that this is a slide that I forgot to put in my original version of the talk. Spiritual alchemy and the psychedelic counterculture before Terence McKenna. So Kenneth Rexroth, in an article, it was actually the introduction to the spiritual alchemy of Thomas Vaughan, which was published in 1967. Said a couple of things about spiritual alchemy that really remind me of what Newman and Principe were doing. And, it's not as if, in the 90s when Newman and Principe published their paper, that this was the first time anybody ever heard of this problem, right? So here's what Rexroth says in the beginning of his introduction. Thomas Vaughan is supposed to be the leading spiritual alchemist of the entire literature. And yet the majority of modern writers on alchemy deny flatly that such a thing as spiritual alchemy ever existed. I really recommend reading the Peter Levenda book on Thomas Vaughan. There's also a really great one by it was I can't remember the name now. There's some great studies on Vaughan, also like from the kind of history of science point of view. But Vaughan was he was the brother of the metaphysical poet Henry Vaughan, right? And Thomas Vaughan's alchemy. One of my favorite stories about him is that he created a logo that integrated his wife's initials into his own to indicate that his wife helped him figure stuff out in the lab and that it was sort of her intellectual property too. But Vaughan was also a disciple of Cornelius Agrippa and deep into the occult philosophy. And it seems like he wasn't just trying to do material alchemy, he was also trying to do some kind of spiritual alchemy. However, most of the books which do, and I'm back to Rexroth now, most of the books which do purport to explain the mysteries of spiritual alchemy are suspect. Their scholarship is shoddy or invented or non-existent. Their logic is cracked, if not paranoid. That's the problem in the historiography of alchemy that Newman and Principe were pointing to. Now, I don't know if McKenna read this or not, but I mean, this stuff was all sort of in the air, right? This was all part of the ambiance, the atmosphere of the counterculture. So in the 60s, people were making recourse to alchemy to explain LSD and psilocybin and all this good stuff. So I also might talk about the Ralph Metzner alchemy chapter in Maps of Consciousness. There's a lovely story of how he was like doing yoga and meditating, and like there was a pot of boiling water that came to whistle on his stove, and he had this like alchemical insight, right? It's a lovely story So Ralph Metzner, who was part of Timothy Leary's psychedelic study at Harvard in the early 60s, along with Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, um, was big into alchemy as like a major metaphor for the kind of transformations that are happening when people take psychedelics. Alan Watts, similarly, in his book The New Alchemy, was trying to, disclose the psychedelic revelation in alchemical terms. So here is McKenna's definition or selling of alchemy in the interview with Neville Drury. Alchemy was the belief that spirit somehow resided at the heart of matter. The alchemists were the heirs to the great Hellenistic religious systems that are generally tagged as Gnostic. The central idea of Gnosticism is that the material of which soul and true being is composed is trapped through a series of cosmic misfortunes in a low-level universe that is alien to it. And the alchemists literalized these ideas to suggest that spirit could somehow be distilled or coaxed from the dense matrix of matter. Well, this is also what the psychedelics reinforce, and it is interesting to see how alchemists at different times, I must have typed this up wrong, to the advancement of pharmacology, contributed to the advancement of pharmacology. For instance, distilled alcohol was discovered by alchemists seeking the elixir of life, and Paracelsus popularized opium. This is not to fault the alchemical quest, but to show that alchemy, the belief that there is spirit and matter, was a survival of an old shamanic strata of belief that involved gaining the allegiance of a plant. And Mircea Eliade is a big influence and an explicit influence on Terence McKenna in this regard. The idea that alchemy is like a shamanic thing, that like alchemy was born out of sort of mystical ideas surrounding metallurgy. So in the State of the Stone address, I'm just going to be looking at a couple of pieces here. McKenna argues, psychedelics are a necessary part of spiritual self-examination. And well, if alchemy is about spiritual self-examination, right, and as Jung has taught us, well, then we should look at alchemy to understand what we're doing, since psychedelics have given us this tool for spiritual self-examination that is, kind of proves its value to anybody who takes the trouble to go and take them, right? Science has very radically failed. So this is the other key thing, right? Is that McKenna wants to look at alchemy as part of the like birth of modern science, to think about, well, what went wrong? How did alchemy contribute to science becoming the way that it is? We live with the impression that science is at the pinnacle of its explanatory power, but like, what's happening, right? We got the rise of fascism, we got climate change, and McKenna argues in many places that politics isn't going to save us. Science isn't going to save us. We need magic. In Unfolding the Stone, I've got lots of stuff here. I haven't unpacked it just yet. If you want to go listen to these talks and tell me what you think, I do welcome any input. So there's this great claim that the slow rise of the patriarchy turned alchemy into a myth, right? Alchemy is part of the mama matrix, most mysterious, right? It's part of this this matriarchal goddess culture, and I think part of this is that McKenna is just trying to sell alchemy to people who are reading books like Leonard Schleine's Alphabet and the Goddess, right? We find what he has to say about Hermeticism here, the idea that man is God's brother, we're not fallen beings, and I really think that Newman and Principe might be saying, well, McKenna's kind of conflating alchemy with gnosis, and this is sort of part of the problem, right? Magic is about overcoming fate. That's something that we find in like Neoplatonic theurgy, right? The idea that the theurgist is able to rise above fate and become installed in the intellections of the demiurge. And certainly there's a lot of overlap with Neoplatonic thinking and alchemical thinking. He's talking about a rebirth of the sense of the stone is what's happening in contemporary counterculture. He's trying to comment on, right? The alchemical stages are seen, according to the Jungians, as like stages in spiritual development. So the easy example is the negredo of alchemy. The blackening part is compared with what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul, right? These kind of like tortured spiritual self-examinations. We can see what he has to say about projection. And then here's the bit about how we're in the hands of the miracle workers. And then here's an interesting thing, right? The redemption of spirit from matter is a historical process, and that's why alchemy is important to the Jungian redemption of the self. And McKenna is saying we can sort of learn something from this about like what we're trying to do as psychedelic people, what psychonauts are doing when they're trying to like integrate their psychedelic experiences. It's very similar to the alchemical integration that Jung is talking about. That alchemy is really about the integration of the psyche. And then we also find where he's comparing alchemy to the spark of the Gnostics or of the Kabbalists. I'm thinking about the especially the Lurianic Kabbalah. I think is maybe part of the story here. And then in the Seeking of the Stone, here's a place where he talks about, he has a chip on his shoulder about modern science, the direct denial of the psychedelic experience. For the Western mind, we have no fixed place in nature. And it occurs to me, that I mean, I'm giving this talk as a way of just sort of processing what I'm doing. This is obviously not finished, but I really could have spent a lot more time, a lot more quality time with my transcribing and my listening, and still got a lot of work to do. It's going to be a fun week. Um, so here's a point where he's talking about what's going on with the way that alchemy led to modern science, and it's an exteriorization, right? So this idea of inner and outer. And he thinks that magic and alchemy were part of how science started looking outside itself. And, I think that Francis Yates is an influence here, right? Because the Yates thesis, so called, right? The idea of the Yates thesis, and I'm going to have to write an elevator pitch for this, a good paragraph summary of that, is that Hermetic ideas, alchemical ideas contributed to modern science because the magician is sort of an operator, right? And in previous, medieval Christian ideas, man shouldn't be taking on that power, right? But we see starting in Roger Bacon, right? And I love to quote Lawrence Principi on this. Roger Bacon said that alchemical gold isn't just the same as natural gold, right? It's artificial gold. It's better, right? It's better. Alchemical gold is sort of more pure. Um, so starting with Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus, those guys, we started to see a kind of like medieval philosophers thinking about alchemy in a more positive way. But Francis Yates argues that it was the occult worldview where man is seen, like in Pico della Mirandola, the magician weds elms to vine, or just as the farmer weds elms to vines, the magician weds passives and actives, right? This idea that man can be an operator if he has this knowledge of the ways that passives and actives go together. It's a very Aristotelian way of conceiving it, right? Then they'll be able to like work their will in the world, work change in the world. And so Yates said, look, like people like John Dee are like kind of forging the scientific worldview, the idea. And I think that that's what Terence McKenna is talking about with this exteriorization. So, Rosicrucian Enlightenment as a model for counterculture. I'm going to need to look at what McKenna likes about the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and once again, I'm just going to have to spend more quality time with my transcripts. So here's a couple of quotes from Francis Yates I'm looking at. The mechanistic worldview established by the 17th century revelation has been in its turn superseded by the amazing latest developments of scientific knowledge. And I think this is kind of where McKenna's at, right? He's like, well, look at like quantum physics. Like, doesn't that prove that like analytic philosophy and logical positivism and all that is just sort of like are just sort of like cops. Um, it may be illuminating, so it's like science is no longer deterministic, right? Science is gone beyond this mechanistic view, or at least that's what like the quantum revolution should be telling us, right? But really, modern science is still kind of like fossilized in this mechanistic worldview. It may be illuminating to view the scientific revolution as in two phases. The first phase consisting of an animistic universe operated by magic, and the second phase of a mathematical universe operated mechanics. Is not all science and gnosis and insight into the all which proceeds by successive revelation? So, here I think that this is a good place to look at it. Why is Terence McKenna talking about how the alchemical worldview sort of led to modern science. The Cartesian mathesis was a vision of genuine mathematics as the clue to the universe and led to the discovery of a genuinely scientific tool for investigations. A transition has been made into an epoch in which what is still a hermetic, almost a Rosicrucian impulse to the world results in valid scientific intuitions. But may not the intensive hermetic training of the imagination towards the world have prepared the way for Descartes to cross that inner frontier? Why was Descartes so contemptuous, even one might think so afraid of the mens, that's the mind, right? The sort of like Neoplatonic intelligible world sort of mind, the world soul kind of mind, that he wanted to park it carefully by itself out of the way of the mechanical universe and of mathematics? Might not this be because of the struggle of his world to emerge from Hermes Trismegistus and all that he stood for? So it's a kind of like anxiety of influence, to quote the late Harold Bloom. The basic difference between the attitude of the magician of the world and the attitude of the scientist, the world is the former wants to draw the world into himself, whereas the scientist just does just the opposite. He externalizes. So when Terence McKenna is talking about the exteriorization, is that something that he's cribbing from Yeats? He externalizes and impersonalizes the world by a movement of will in an entirely opposite direction to that described in the Hermetic writings. Maybe my style should just be sort of like, here's a Yeats quote, here's a McKenna quote, and I'll just kind of weave them together. Love to know your thoughts on like how I should structure this. I'm still really struggling to kind of formulate the argument and put, what am I going to write? Where am I going to put each of my quotes? And how am I going to comment on them and stuff? So I would invite any of your thoughts, and if anybody just wants to write the paper for me, that'd be great too. Whether as religious experience or as magic, the hermetic attitude to the world has this internal quality. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, quote found near the end of this talk, and I have this Redditor to thank for pointing that out to me because, honestly, I had lost track of this quotation and I really wanted to write about it. And like for months, I've been searching for it. I finally found it Googling, and this dude on Reddit helped me out. So I discovered where in the 5 hours of recordings of this Hermeticism talk. So the story is, so Michael Maier, right, was the author of A Talent of Fugianes, which is this marvelous book of alchemical emblems. And he becomes, for McKenna, a sort of symbol of the alchemical vitalistic worldview. And McKenna sort of fantasizes. He imagines this scenario, right? He says, well, look, we don't know how Michael Maier died. He disappears from the historical record at a certain time, right? And Descartes was actually like historically, I don't know if this is a factor, if this is just McKenna. Descartes was like part of this invading army or like moving in with this invading army. And Michael Maier was in the state that was being invaded, or the city that was being invaded. And Terence McKenna actually imagines Descartes being the soldier who murdered Michael Maier by driving a spear through his body, right? And I think that this is just such a beautiful image that really goes to the heart of what McKenna is doing with alchemy and the way that he's using alchemy to kind of do his critique of modern science and recommending Yeats's Rosicrucian Enlightenment as a vision for psychedelic counterculture. Thanks for coming to my talk. I know that went long. I really do appreciate you all checking it out, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I do welcome any feedback. If you want to send me an email to ted.hand@gmail.com or just leave comments on this YouTube. Have a good one.